Our last speaker to talk about difficult messages, even though he's not wearing cool shoes, is part of the Bubbles crew. I want some of those shoes. And in his spare time, he dabbles in PEM. Thanks, Damian.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for making it. I nearly didn't make it on Monday, and then after some fun times last night, don't think I nearly made it this morning as well. So apologies for my husky tones. Thank you very much to Andrew Tagg to begin with for this particular slide. I tweeted out observation as an investigation, I think in about 2014, 2015, and this meme, I keep using meme, my kids keep telling me it's meme, Dad, it's meme, has been percolating for a while, but I've never really had a chance to talk about it and discuss things. And the reason I think this is important is that we work in very busy units. Now, not everyone is PEM. I think you should be. I accept some of you have chosen not to do the holy art. Some of you have chosen to be surgeons, and it's quite frankly ridiculous. But we work in an environment, wherever it is, where it's busy, we're pressured, there's a lot of patients, there's a lot of stress, and we need to help ourselves make the right decision. Part of illness is about predicting its trajectory. So we've had a talk to begin with on predicting the trajectory of mental health and well-being after an injury. We've had a talk on predicting the outcomes after abdominal pain, query appendicitis, but actually those trajectories apply to anything. And I've got an interest in safety netting, the advice we give to families when they are discharged from hospital. And what we're trying to do is promote self-care. So I don't want you to come back unnecessarily because that takes up more time, is more risk for other patients. I don't want you to come back too late because that is utterly disastrous. So we've got this sweet spot where patients are on an illness that we can intervene in a timely fashion. The fundamental problem is thinking is bloody difficult. I mean, it's really hard. And it's not just from a metacognition point of view. Literally, you burn up more glucose when you're under pressure. And there are numerous studies looking at the action of various hormones. But ultimately, stress is a real challenge. And I've been really interested in a book called Behave, which looks at the amalgamation of the neuroendocrine system and our actual emotions and what we do. And it's really clear that stress has quite an impact. And we make riskier decisions when we're stressed. So in a busy emergency department, when you've got lots of things coming on to you, when you become more stressed, you're actually more likely to make a bad decision. Interestingly, there is some research that demonstrates if we take some moderate stress, perhaps like presenting like I am now, men, when they get that level of stress, take more risky decisions and women take less risky ones. That's not saying one is right or wrong, but that's a biological difference in the way that we look at things. Ultimately, though, on a busy emergency department floor, your brain has too many tabs. Open at any given time. It's like the web browser where you've opened, and you've got too much stuff percolating through your brain. I went to see Wicked with my family last week or so, and there was this lovely quote that just kind of spoke to me while one of the performers was singing. It's not about aptitude, it's the way you're viewed. And so what I want to do is just discuss some of the processes that we can use when we're thinking about whether to observe a child or not. And there's very little research on this. Some research has been done. There's a chap called Brad Wright, who I worked with. He's an American. And we interviewed a number of emergency medicine consultants in America and some in the UK to ask them about why they observed some patients. So this was, if you're not discharging them, you're not admitting them, why do you use observation units? Why do you keep them in your waiting room? And there was no good, clear answer. The Americans came up with a lot of financial reasons for doing things. In the UK, less so. But everyone had this concept of a safe space. Okay? I'm trying to create an area where I can reduce the cognitive load on my brain so I can have something work out for me, and then I can make a better decision. Now, to begin with, I want to make really clear that there are some situations where a period of observation is never going to work. You can't observe everyone. So if you have 100 children presenting to your emergency department and you stick 100 of them in the observation unit or 100 of them back out in the waiting room, that's not doing anything useful for you. And you clearly don't need to observe everyone. And there's this weird concept. It's a bit like gut feeling. I have these staff come up to me and they go, "Oh, Damian, I've got this gut feeling about a patient. They're tachycardic, their respiratory rate's high, their capillary refill time's over 5 seconds, their feet aren't warm anymore, they've had a fever, they've got this spreading petechial rash. My gut feeling is it's meningococcal septicemia." No, it's not. There's no gut feeling in that. This child has clinical signs of someone who is really ill, okay? Gut feeling is when you make a decision against the information that's presented to you. So if I see a child and they're hot and tachycardic and they've got a snotty nose and mum's really worried about them and they look a bit dusky, and I go, actually, just take some paracetamol, go home, that's gut feeling. Because I'm making a decision against the information presented to me, and I hope for the grace of God that I'm right. And that is the challenge that we are faced with all the time in pediatrics. Gut feeling is an interesting thing, and this is really the best and only study I can find out to show how rubbish it is. So this is a study by Nate Cooperman and his team in America. You take a load of babies, okay? If they're under 60 days and they've got no previous risk factors, they've got a fever, okay, their risk of having a serious bacterial illness, either urine, meningitis, etc., is 9%. Every study has found between about 7 and 11%. If you ask the clinician, though, before they've done anything, they've just seen the child with the fever, what they think that chance of that child having an infection is, and you compare it to what happens, everyone's useless. No one got it. Are there any Americans in the audience? Okay, so if there aren't, I can say, maybe the problem with this study is it was done in America, and they have useless gut feeling. Now, that's really harsh. But I'm convinced this study applies anywhere you work. And everyone, I can't remember who I was having a conversation to, you need to follow up patients. If you're claiming that you're using gut feeling to make a decision, and then you're not following up what actually happens to that patient, you'll never know whether your gut feeling was right or not. So an observation works in a similar way. Now, this is my brain. This is just my brain taking some information to share with you. I don't know whether this is right or wrong, and I'd be really interested in feedback through questions. I think you have children who are low, medium, and high risk in terms of what might happen to them, and you have observation which might be micro, medium, or macro, i.e. in terms of what observation you need. So, child presents, they've got a fever, they might be a bit miserable, you want to find out what happens to them after some paracetamol, they're likely to have a virus, it's going to be a short period of observation. So that's one particular concept. By the way, there is still absolutely no evidence that the predictive response of an antipyretic can rule in or out serious bacterial illness. We all do it, but there's absolutely no evidence for it. A medium risk is, so I take a child who perhaps has had anaphylactic reaction, and you're going to observe them for a period of time after their adrenaline. I don't know what that time period of observation should be. Could be 4 to 5 hours. We've got further work to do. But there's a risk that that child might get worse again. I've not put it in high risk because I think that they've presented relatively well. That's one concept. And the last thing, let's say a child with febrile convulsion, that they're still a bit post-ictal, but your gut feeling is they'll get better, so they're high risk because they still could have meningitis, but you just want to watch them over the next hour, 90 minutes, check that they are recovering across a trajectory. And so this is how I think we can start thinking about who we should be observing and where that observation should take place. Is it in the waiting room? Is it in the cubicle they're in? Do you have a short stay unit? And these are all questions that I think without this kind of map we can't start answering. And I don't think we've really done a huge amount of work looking at how people make those different decisions. But I just want to pick a few choice scenarios. So one is head injury observation. And what happens with head injury observation is that sometimes the child gets a CT at the end of the observation period, regardless of how long that observation period is, because maybe they have more vomits, maybe the parents get really concerned, maybe the clinician uses their nerve, and then you end up using another investigation just to help you discharge that patient anyway. And I think that plays out more often than we realize. The other thing is the difference between observation and a clinical pathway. And so if you've got, in my example, the child with a fever and a spreading petechial rash, that's a red flag and you're going to act on it. What do you do with the well-appearing child who has 2 petechiae? They may have been there for a couple of hours and they've had a bit of a fever. And we actually are starting to build an evidence base for this now, based on whether red flags are present or no red flags are present. And there is work in the UK that is suggesting we don't need to do blood tests on these patients if that rash isn't spreading and other factors are equal. And I really recommend you go to this website because there's a number of evidence-based pathways of care for particular conditions. And again, this is getting slightly outside of the observation remit, but I think it's an important principle. Are you looking at this child because they're on a pathway, or do you just want to observe something else? And then the other thing is language. Language is so important when we are dealing with parents and carers. Now, I think in Australia and other places, you have a concept of kind of red, amber, and green risk. I think Between the Flags uses that. Our National Institute for Clinical Excellence guidelines kind of stratifies disease processes. And what's interesting is the language that we use is very different from what the parents use. And this is really important when we're talking about safety netting and the need for observation, because I might think in my head, this child is completely well. They can just go home with safety net advice. But the parent has come with a concern, and that concern is still present. And you may be using observation just to prove to that family that that particular concern can go away. But if you're just using observation to do that, is that not something that can be done by adequate explanation, engagement? Sometimes it can, sometimes it needs a bit longer. Amber's a bit more interesting because you've got someone who you're a bit concerned about, but might be the most unwell that this child has ever been for their parents. And if you stick them on the observation unit and then they may get worse because that's why you've done it, what will the parent come back to you with? Is that a failure? Is that a medical failure? Is that a missed never event type situation? Or is it just a natural progression of disease? And that all needs clarifying. So a key thing is that having started talking about observation as a means to do something, so an investigation, full blood count, CRP, X-ray, and observation, and I try and put those in the same bracket. If we're really being honest with ourselves, you can, at the point of review, it's easy to count a respiratory rate. You can measure a temperature. You see a fracture. These are all things that are right in front of you. Why can't you just make a decision? Okay? What is observation offering you against all the other clinical information that you have? And so what I want to leave you with is changing my own paradigm. Is observation isn't so much of an investigation as a need to make a decision. Okay? A child presents, they may or not be unwell. Okay? What are you doing and why are you observing? What is the clinical feature of the observation that is going to change what you do? Because if you're doing it just because you can, then that is nonsensical. Because I can guarantee you, not many people in this room at a senior level are going to thank you. I did the CRP just because. That never goes down well. I'm just observing, just because. So, ultimately, it's a stressful place, an emergency department assessment unit. You have a cognitive load on you, and you need to use observation wisely to help you make that decision. And I think at the moment, there are probably far more questions about how that process occurs than there are actual answers. Thank you very much for your time.